So Robert Hart, of course, was the son of a Methodist distiller. Yes, you heard that correctly, son of a Methodist distiller from Portadown in Lisbon. And for those of you who don't know, he spent 45 years in China as Inspector General of the Imperial Maritime Customs. During this period, those 45 years, Robert Hart exerted so wide an influence that he has been called 1/3 of the Trinity in power in China in the later 19th century. Between 1863 and 1908, he was the head of a multinational staff imposed on the Chinese government by the British during the Second Opium War. Hart, in that role, helped to shape the foreign relations of late imperial China. By 1900, his maritime customs had a staff of 14,000 at least, depending on how you count, and raised the bulk of Qing imperial revenue. His influence extended far beyond the customs. He transformed China's infrastructure, established a postal service, a network of lighthouses, helped to shape the foreign relations of late imperial China in many other ways too. So the backdrop to Hart's career was the imperialism of Victorian Britain, and it was Britain above all which had forced China to accept trade on foreign terms during the 2 Opium Wars, and Britain which had demanded China accept a foreign staffed customs service to police that trade. Long after Hart had resigned from his position as a British consular interpreter, Hart saw himself as a sort of metaphorical translator between Britain and China. And Hart's belief in the merits of British governance ensured that for most of his career he remained optimistic that China and Britain could reach mutually beneficial agreements, at least in theory, if not in practice. In a generally indulgent biography, Hart's niece, Juliet Braden, noted her uncle was once described as a small, insignificant Irishman, but few of his contemporaries would have recognised that assessment. His empire was as much a personal one as it was an agency of British influence, in fact, rather more so, as I'll argue today. And he was frequently at odds with British policy, most notoriously after the suppression of the Boxer Uprising. A complex sense of identity led Hart to describe himself variously as British, Irish, English, an Ulsterman, and even as a Paddy, but Hart's notorious nepotism was very local. He drew repeatedly upon what he called the banks of the Lagan, but in truth the ban was just as fertile a recruiting ground for staff to perform what he called the world's work in so far off an empire. But despite these deeply felt and deeply retained links to Ireland and to Ulster in particular, he had little interest in unionist politics and retired to England. So a complicated individual. He's attracted significant scholarly attention over the years from his former employee and pioneering historian of Sino-Western relations, H.B. Morse, his first biographer, and his first biographer, an Ulsterman and another employee, Stanley Wright. Onwards through to contemporary specialists in imperialism and globalization in China, including Hans van der Ven and Robert Vickers. The prism through which historians view Sino-foreign relations has shifted dramatically in that time. In 1953, pioneering Harvard sinologist John Fairbank argued that the foreign presence in China in the later 19th century amounted to synarchy, a harmonious alignment of the interests of the ethnically Manchu elite of the Qing dynasty with the foreign powers which supported that dynasty against internal Chinese rebels and strengthened the Chinese state through military reform, industrialization, and bureaucratic expansion. By the 1980s, that view had fallen pretty decisively out of fashion, and Western and Chinese historians could broadly agree that the late Qing state had been remade at foreign gunpoint, with any alignment of interests closer to that between kidnapper and hostage than between equal governments. The Chinese state was not formally supplanted across broad swaths of China until Japanese expansionism, but China had, by the 1980s, become part of European imperial historiography. Lenin's phrase semi-colony was rediscovered to describe the Chinese experience of Western presence, while Robinson and Gallagher's idea of informal empire was deployed to categorize the nature of foreign and particularly British influence in China. This model was refined and applied to China's competing foreign powers by, for example, Jürgen Osterhammel in 1986, and the new consensus, along with its limitations, was laid out again by Osterhammel in 1998 in the standard reference work on British imperialism, The Oxford History of the British Empire. Since the turn of the 21st century, global and transnational history have swept through Chinese historiography as through the rest of the historical discipline. focusing attention on transnational flows of goods, people and ideas, reframing the analysis beyond the state, and onto what Hans van der Ven has called a network of transnational elites, relocating discussion around Asia rather than the West. The expansion of Chinese infrastructure, Chinese political and social debates, and China's participation in international institutions have all come to be seen in regional and global context rather than through a narrow imperial lens. This historiographical turn has also brought a welcome departure from the tendency to use Victorian Britain as a synecdoche for all European imperialism. An emphasis on how globalizing Chinese trade flows could actually be disadvantageous has emerged, for example, focusing on less powerful European nations such as Spain. So through all these historiographical debates, from Fairbank and Sineke, through the idea of semi-colonialism and informal empire, onto today's focus of globalization, through all of this, Hart himself has remained a key figure in late Qing history, and certainly the most powerful foreigner at the twilight of imperial China. Robert Bickers and Hans van der Ven have both complained of the scholarly cult of Hart, but it's worth remembering that it was Bickers himself who organised the rededication of Hart's grave in 2013, and Hans van der Ven's recent book on Chinese modernisation, Breaking with the Past, is at times close to a biography of Hart. So you can't really tell the story of late Qing China, and certainly not of late Qing China's interactions with the West, without putting Robert Hart near the centre of it. Hart has, however, been an awkward fit within all these interpretative frameworks for understanding Sino-foreign relations. Sineke, empire, globalisation. Hart's place in Chinese history cannot be understood independently from the British state which put him there. Yet he was frequently one of the fiercest critics of British policy in China. Robert Bickers has noted Hart's tenuous position as a non-Chinese director of an agency of the Chinese state. Hart's much-quoted 1881 remark that I want to make China strong and I want her to make England her best friend can be seen as either wildly naive or profoundly cynical, depending on your point of view. This idea that perhaps Britain and China could simply find their interests coalescing. As Hart himself admitted, and I'll return to this at the end of today's talk, as Hart himself admitted, there have been a mixture of motives. Self, the public, and China have all been intermixed, perhaps with more weight given to number one than was right. Number one, a little pun there for the first item in his list, which was, of course, self. I'll return later to the idea of the public and what public that was to be distinguished from China. So self, the public, and China. So what is this public? And as Hart himself in that quote pointed out, it's worth exploring how far Hart's loyalties were to himself and more broadly his kin and the social networks around the communities in which he grew up, and the extent to which the customs service can be seen as an imperium in imperio long before it was accused of being such in the Republican period. But as awkwardly as Hart has sat within the historiography of Sino-foreign relations, in which history, of course, he played so central a part, he has been, I would suggest, no more comfortably located in the historiographies of global and/or imperial Ireland. Given the fact that Hart was one of the most globally influential Irish-born figures of the 19th century, remarkably little attention has been paid to Hart's Irishness by historians of either global Britain or global Ireland. Two articles by my former Queen's colleague Richard O'Leary, who's here today, examine Hart's Irish roots, a phrase which I think Richard will forgive me, perhaps alludes to the potentially constricting nature of debates about Irish identity. Hilary Carey and Colin Barr noted in their 2015 Religion in Greater Ireland that the history of Irish Protestantism is badly served in Ireland itself, let alone in Ireland's diaspora. All too often, important Irish Protestant networks can only be seen in glimpses in wider studies with secular concerns. And though a broader conception of Ireland opens the door to richer studies of global Irish Protestant experience and identity, it's noteworthy that Irish historians are becoming interested in Greater Ireland and the Irish world, just as British historians, like Rachel Bright and Andrew Dilley, are beginning to question the utility of the British world concept, noting that it has failed to take adequate account of the structures of power. Imperialism in Ulster and in Northern Ireland remains, I would suggest, an understudied subject, explored often through the teleological prism of partition, and too infrequently in the broader context of 19th century Irish and Ulster identities. Insofar as these analyses do exist of transnational Irish Protestantism, beyond faith itself, they often foreground empire, union and the state, from imperial proconsuls like Lord Dufferin to the enlisted soldiers of the Irish regiments. At a personal level, Hart certainly saw British government service as his ticket to wealth and status. Yet too narrow an emphasis on, or too narrow a perspective on the relationship to the British state is, I'd suggest, a wholly inadequate approach to Hart's global role and also to how we might understand his Irishness. Instead, I'd like to suggest that Hart should be seen, as he saw himself, as a sort of secular missionary, his approach to China shaped by wider Irish evangelicalism, though increasingly Ulster-centric in various ways, which I'll try to hint at today. So in this paper, I'll be talking a little bit about Ulster's most recalcitrant imperialist, and hopefully suggesting some ways of making sense of him and his links to Ireland and Empire. Robert Hart was born in Portadown, County Armagh, on the 20th of February 1835, the first child of Methodist parents. Robert Hart's father, Henry, was already attracted to Wesleyanism by the time he married Anne Edgar at the old Drumcree Church in 1834. Drumcree was a parish which had been greatly influenced by Wesleyanism, and John Wesley visited it on multiple occasions. Robert Hart's maternal family, the Edgars, were Methodists, and by 1839 at the latest, Henry Hart was a Methodist as well. Both Henry Hart and above all Henry's brother-in-law Richard Edgar, that's Hart's mother's brother, so both Henry Hart and Richard Edgar were prominent Portadown Methodists. Hart's paternal grandfather John Edgar was a successful flax farmer from Ballybray outside Portadown. But Richard, John Edgar's son Richard, had transformed the family's fortunes by marrying the daughter of Henry Atkin, owner of the Mandeville Arms Hotel on High Street in Portadown. Portadown expanded rapidly in the 1820s and 1830s, and Richard was soon running a business empire from the hotel, selling seeds, providing carriages and coaches, acting as postmaster, and taking over the hotel itself in 1837. As Portadown expanded, Methodism expanded with it. The first Methodist chapel opened in the town in 1832, and both Henry Hart and Richard Edgar gave generously to the campaign to expand the church premises a few years later. Henry Hart donating £3 in 1840 and Richard Edgar £5. Henry Hart was described as a man of forceful and picturesque character, of a somewhat antique strain, and a Wesleyan to the core. The Harts was a household where the standard dinner time inquiry was, "What have you been doing for God today?" The family's religious convictions were reflected in the fact that, with no Wesleyan school in Ulster until 1868, Robert was sent first to Taunton and then to Dublin to the Wesleyan Connectional School. To describe Robert Hart simply as coming from a Methodist family, though, barely hints at the complexity surrounding Hart's religious identity. Richard O'Leary has described Hart as, in many ways, quite untypical of evangelical Ulster Protestants, and I hope he'll forgive me if I suggest that may be something of an understatement. Hart wrote that, "Though socially I consider polygamy inexpedient in the West, I do not think it inexpedient in China, nor do I consider it morally wrong in itself." He then went on to say that he thought if he were to, that it might be quite a good idea for himself. Hart's womanizing was so scandalous among his extended family that it is still remembered with wry amusement by his local descendants in Portadown over a century after his death. According to local tradition, some of Hart's in-laws took care long into the 20th century to remind their neighbours that they were connected to Sir Robert only by marriage and not by blood, lest anyone think them tainted by his reputation. Young Robert himself had some decidedly free-thinking instincts, writing aged 16 that reasoning based on the Bible could hold only if the Bible be believed. And Robert Hart's father was himself familiar with religious censure. Henry Hart followed his own father, James, so Robert Hart's grandfather, into the business which had made them comfortable, though not rich, alcohol, specifically spirits. Methodism's attitude to alcohol was a complex one in this period, of course. Wesley on several occasions had called for caution in relation to alcohol, particularly when distilled, but teetotalism only began to become a significant aspect of Methodist practice in the 1830s. The Ulster Temperance Society was formed in 1829 and included Methodists as well as the Presbyterians more often associated with the early years of the movement. And in 1838, Portadown Methodists passed a resolution condemning ardent spirits. And despite this, Hart's uncle and father retained their alcohol-related employments, apparently to the increasing discomfort of the Portadown Methodist community. An early history of Portadown Methodism claims, against all other factual information, that Hart's ubiquitous uncle, Richard Edgar, was, though a member of society, i.e. a member of the Methodist community, he was not closely connected with it, not having any official position, which is not really the sense of Richard Edgar that you get from reading other things. During Robert Hart's childhood and youth, Henry Hart was employed by at least 3 whiskey distilleries. The same history of Portadown Methodism describes Henry as a clerk in the distillery, though in fact we know that he was a manager. And a contemporary local poem makes very clear the extent of Henry Hart's involvement in distillation. John Barleycorn we must prepare until he makes his lawful heir. In harvest time they cut him down, just like a villain or a clown. They bound him fast upon a cart and sent him off to Mr. Hart. Oh, drink your fill, it is no sin, it far exceeds your foreign gin. So despite the best efforts of Portadown Methodists to write alcohol out of the history of their community, reality is clearly rather more complicated. In 1839, Hart's distillery in Milltown burned down in a fire. But even that catastrophe, which some men of his temperament might have taken as evidence of divine disfavour, did not push Henry into a different career. So somebody a student in geography here, Jordan Mbois, did a very nice little project for us, identifying the mill and the distillery and the site where it burned down. So the most fundamental lesson which Hart seems to have drawn from his parents' religious faith was pragmatism in relation to even the most strongly held principles, and it should come as no surprise that years later in China, Hart's approach to the opium trade was not to try to suppress it, but to attempt to establish a British-controlled global opium monopoly. So how did Robert Hart find himself in China in the first place? Well, he demonstrated precocious academic ability and aged 15 returned to Ulster from his school in Dublin to study for a BA at Queen's College, Belfast in 1850. Queen's had, of course, begun accepting students the previous year. As an ecumenical institution, Queen's quickly became popular with Presbyterians and Methodists alike, as we know. While at Queen's, Hart took prizes in multiple subjects, and he graduated in 1853, aged 18, with a first and a senior scholarship. Empire offered young men from humble backgrounds, including Irishmen, the opportunity for rapid advancement, and was an obvious route for a brilliant student like Hart. Yet that did not mean that class, denomination, and place of origin were irrelevant. The Indian civil service, into the heaven-born ranks of which Hart might well have been expected just a few years later to have achieved acceptance, still recruited by patronage rather than examination at the time that Hart graduated in 1853. As Ruth Dudley Edwards has shown, Irish applicants were severely disadvantaged in the ICS recruitment process. The one exception to that was during a brief period of comparative meritocracy between 1855 and 1863, so 1855, 2 years after Hart graduated. Had he gone to university 2 years later, so at the proper time for his age, or had he been 2 years younger, he would most likely have taken the first ICS exam, and his administrative talents might have been directed towards an entirely different part of the British imperial project. But at the moment of his graduation in 1853, the ICS was still inaccessible to a man like Hart, and his thoughts turned instead to life as a missionary, articulating the convictions and fellowship of the community which had shaped him. Now, had Hart followed this early inclination, he would have been a quintessential exponent of what Sarah Boddy has called the very peculiar circumstances of the surge of Irish mission participation in the mid-19th century, shaped by complex currents of religious and cultural identity. Already in 1853, Hart had set his heart on mission to China, a highly unusual decision. The first Protestants active in China in the modern period were from the interdenominational Evangelical London Missionary Society, starting with Robert Morrison in Canton in 1807, and was spoken of admiringly in missionary circles, but were not Irish. The opening of the 5 treaty ports in China in 1842 after the First Opium War attracted a trickle of missionaries, particularly to Shanghai, Xiamen and Canton, and included 3 graduates of TCD, notably William Armstrong Russell. But only after Britain and France obtained the right for missionaries to travel inland after the Second Opium War in 1860 did that trickle become a steady stream. There was no specifically Irish Protestant mission in China until the Presbyterian Church in Ireland mission from 1869. Yet Hart was already thinking of China in 1853. His only awareness of the country at that time, beyond the geopolitical situation, seems to have been the sense that China presented a formidable challenge to missionary activity, and it was precisely this which attracted the 18-year-old Hart, who prayed that I might be sent there, thinking my abilities pretty good. I supposed I could easily manage the language and be of use to this nation. There it is. Hart's missionary aspirations collapsed, however, when, hardly uniquely among students, he for a while around graduation abandoned the rigorous self-discipline of his school years and acquired a taste for nightlife and sexual encounters. So thoroughly did Hart enjoy himself that he ended up pawning the prize medals he had won at Queen's. He abandoned thoughts of mission, judging himself morally unqualified, having, as he put it, sinned most shamefully. Interestingly, this entire process of his attraction to mission and then his conviction that he was unsuited for it seems to have happened predominantly inside his own imagination. I've so far failed to find much evidence that he discussed his sense of vocation in a more formal way. So, uncertain of what to do next, Hart took up a scholarship to pursue postgraduate work at Queen's in modern languages. Hart's first exposure to more detailed information about China came when he had already abandoned his missionary hopes, when he took a girl he liked, Cordelia Hardy, to hear the prominent Dublin evangelical minister William Urwick the Elder lecture on China in 1854. The lectures were held at the primitive Methodist chapel at Donegal Place, which had been erected a few years earlier in 1842, and cost the sizable amount of 1 shilling and 6pence per ticket. Interestingly, Hart seems to have attended this chapel primarily for the lectures, and not as part of a regular pattern of devotion. Recalling the lectures just only a few months later, Hart misremembered the street address of the primitive chapel, suggesting at the very least a lack of familiarity with the primitives chapels in Belfast. The London Missionary Society in 1854 was seeking funding for 10 new missionaries to China to follow in the footsteps of Robert Morrison. Urwick hoped Irish donors would fund at least one of these new missionaries, and he subjected himself to a punishing lecture schedule organised by the Young Men's Christian Association, speaking in Dublin on the 7th of February and then in Belfast on the 8th of February, and so forth. The Belfast lectures attracted the attention of the city mayor, Frederick Lewis, who chaired them. Urwick had been interested in Chinese mission for around 20 years, but not to any greater degree than he was interested in mission anywhere else, and his burst of Chinese enthusiasm evaporated as quickly as it arrived. Despite his relative ignorance of China, Urwick cobbled together an entertaining pair of lectures, bursting with curiosities of Chinese life and encomiums to China's importance in global affairs. He drew his information from accounts by British missionary sinologists like Morrison, but also W.H. Medhurst and James Legge. Urwick chose not to mention two Irishmen with obvious connections to China, namely Lord Macartney and the first Sir George Staunton. Macartney's 1793 failure to persuade China to join Britain's global trade networks would have distracted from the portrait Urwick wished to paint of Sino-foreign interaction based on mutual benefit. On the other hand, Staunton's English-born son of the same name, the great Orientalist and legal scholar, was mentioned approvingly for his work with Chinese legal texts. Urwick considered Chinese law to be like passing from darkness to light when compared to other Asian legal codes, and he quoted the Edinburgh Review's assessment of Qing law that we scarcely know any European code which is at once so copious and so consistent, or so free from intricacy, bigotry, and fiction. One Orientalist idea about China, which accorded particularly closely with the preoccupations of Irish evangelicalism at that moment, was the notion that Chinese industriousness presented opportunities for cooperation with British imperialism. In Canton in the 1830s, Karl Gutzlaff, Lord Napier and others argued that the hard-working Han Chinese would value the trading links rejected by their Manchu government. Gutzlaff considered the Manchus were culturally predisposed to idleness, while Napier observed of Han Chinese that every man is constantly at work, so contrast was being drawn between the Qing imperial dynasty, with whom perhaps it would be impossible for the British to deal, and ordinary Chinese people who were held out as perhaps being more receptive to British government intentions. A Chinese proverb cited by Medhurst, that under the whole heaven there is nothing difficult, it is only that men's minds are not determined, was quoted by Urwick with delight, who exhorted his young Irish audience, "Oh, were the millions of minds in Ireland and the hundreds of millions of minds in China thus resolutely and prayerfully concentrated, what a truly wise, understanding nation would each become, and how brightly would they shine as lights in the world." When at the very end of the second lecture Urwick made his pitch in earnest, his observations accorded very closely with Hart's own aspirations. Artisans, manufacturers, merchants, look at the range opening before you in China and say, will you not assist in prospering to your power its interest, in which your own and those of your country are also involved? Truly, we live in wondrously stirring times. Oh, to be blessed with a soul large, observant, earnest, self-sacrificing, devout, and abounding in all wise, righteous, and generous activities, unswerving to the genius of the gospel, the position of our country, and the claims of our age. So stirring stuff there to try to elicit donations and missionary enthusiasm. By prospering to your power its interest, i.e. working in China's interest, Urwick averred you would be simultaneously advancing both your own interests and those of your country. For a man like Robert Hart, endowed with both wild ambition and a strong sense of religious duty, Urwick's suggestion that these need not be in conflict presented an appealing prospect. So that was the hard sell, the pitch that Hart got from Urwick's lectures on China, although Hart was to some extent already sold on China even before he heard them. A few weeks after Urwick's February lectures, the Foreign Office announced that each of the Irish colleges would be asked to nominate a student interpreter to serve in China. Hart decided to apply for the Queen's nomination, encouraged by his teachers, particularly the philosopher James McCosh, whom Andrew mentioned last week, later the president of Princeton, and the chemist Thomas Andrews. Andrews was known as a chemist, but moonlighted as a temperance campaigner, while McCosh, of course, was a leading exponent of Scottish common sense realism, precisely the sort of flexibly pragmatic intellectual approach which would appeal to somebody growing up in a household like Hart's. Andrew Holmes has noted in his new book that McCosh's influence shaped the outlook of a generation of Presbyterian writers and educators. But through Hart, McCosh could be said to have influenced the development of the modern Chinese state as well. In 1854, Hart's nomination to the British Consular Service constituted a unique opportunity for an Ulsterman without connections or status to obtain a diplomatic post. As well as the generous pay of £200 and ongoing financial security and social status, Hart was also attracted by the chance to make a practical impact in the world, or, in his most revealing words, to keep from having to choose between the law and the gospel. I had really quite an extraordinary remark. Hart's belief that British consular service might offer the chance to serve God, that it could be a kind of secular missionary service, shows how deeply the approach to China laid out in Erwick's lectures had hit home, though I suppose you might argue it also exhibits something of his father's pragmatic ability to make the best of his circumstances. But that was the a mindset with which Hart went out to China, that by serving the British state in China, he would keep from having to decide between the law and the gospel. The China nomination also provided Hart with the chance to, as he put it, get away from the scene of my misconduct. Though those of you familiar with Hart will know that in the event, Hart found new opportunities for sexual misconduct in China. Certainly Queen's was sufficiently impressed by Hart's candidacy to cancel the exam they planned to hold and nominate him without further delay. Though Hart went to China as a trainee diplomat and not as a missionary, it was, I suggest, this missionary worldview which had formed Hart's expectations of China, and specifically through the Irish evangelical and Methodist traditions of the 1840s and 1850s, through men like Erwick with no direct knowledge of China, in fact, that the young Robert Hart had inhaled a certain view of the country which Erwick and later Hart himself labelled with the biblical phrase, the land of Sinim. According to this view, China presented a unique combination of glorious culture, intimidating yet exciting difficulties, a vast number of souls awaiting the gospel, and a vast economy which could benefit from globalization. The Irish evangelical vision of China before the Second Opium War was drawn from the writings of British missionaries like Medhurst, and from a theological standpoint, there was, at least at this level, perhaps nothing distinctively Irish about it. But what was perhaps most characteristic of Irish evangelical perceptions of China at that specific historical moment was their disconnection from the complexities of missionary practice, complexities which became readily apparent when reading Medhurst himself and the other sources that inspired missionary fundraisers. So we might say then that the China which Hart was pursuing when he went out in 1854 was a sort of imaginary China, invented to stimulate evangelical fervour and, to a certain degree, unencumbered by reality. On his arrival in Hong Kong as a trainee British consular interpreter in 1854, Hart's first thought was of his birth town of Portadown, though he had not lived there since he was 7 years old. This climate and the disease it produces may lay me in the dust, he told his diary, but China and Ireland were, he consoled himself, all the same to God. Shall I not rest as well, he asked himself, beneath the rocky soil of this happy valley in Hong Kong, as though I lay in Drumcree churchyard, mine mingling with the dust of his forefathers, and there you have Drumcree churchyard and the Happy Valley churchyard. In 1859, Hart, of course, left British consular service to join the new Imperial Maritime Customs in China, serving not the British government but China's Qing court. In 1863, he became Inspector General of the Maritime Customs, aged over 28, only 28, and he went on to hold that post for 45 years until 1908. The Imperial Maritime Customs was global, imperial, and Chinese all at once, as I hinted at the beginning of this talk. It was a kind of chimera mandated by British treaty. The 1858 Treaty of Tianjin, an interim settlement which Britain extracted during the Second World War, had committed China to a uniform system of customs at every port. The high officer appointed by the Chinese government to superintend foreign trade will be at liberty to select any British subject he may see fit to aid him in the administration of the customs revenue. This led to the creation of a foreign-staffed body, briefly British alone, then international, to administer the taxation of China's international trade. Legally, the Maritime Customs was part of the Qing state, but the customs had an important role in representing British and other foreign interests in China. Most importantly for our purposes today, the Maritime Customs was committed by both practice and treaty to promoting China's global trade. Hart instructed his staff that the duties of the customs included ensuring that trade was as much facilitated and as little fettered as possible, though he did rapidly remind them that this was to ensure that the coffers of the Qing revenue are most rapidly filled. Hans van der Ven has suggested that Hart stood for the ideals of liberal progress oriented towards the world of the British Empire, but expressed frequently in terms of abstract ideas of globalization, I would add. Hart's nephew Frederick Mays, who later served as Inspector General himself, described the Maritime Customs as an outpost of the British Empire, but it's hard to reach that conclusion about the customs under Hart. Hans van der Ven has called Hart a man in the middle, in the sense of occupying a nodal point in Sino-foreign networks. But I'd like to suggest that Hart was perceived as a man in the middle in another sense as well. Security experts, of course, use the term to describe someone in a position to deceive and manipulate by controlling the flow of information. Hart had long been doubtful of the capacity of British power to endure, confiding to his diary in 1855, during the Irish-led Eureka Rebellion in Australia, that by and by England will have no colonies. Then, what then? Despite Hart's instinct for compromise and his doubts about Britain's imperial future, the British government offered him the post of British Minister to China in 1885. So, for those of you not familiar with diplomatic niceties, the ministership was equivalent to an ambassadorship in a context where the degree of state recognition was not complete. So, the equivalent of the ambassadorship. The offering of that post in 1885 was understandable. Hart was by far the best informed British figure with regard to Chinese politics, and he had just successfully negotiated the end of the Sino-French War. But Hart ultimately renounced the post to stay in the customs. Firmly Tory John Bull magazine observed that though the British government have lost the services of an able man, Sir Robert's influence in favour of British interests could probably be exerted in quite as great a degree as the Inspector General of Customs, as in the position of British Minister. John Bull was also emphatic and correct that the recent fall of the Liberal government during the Irish Home Rule crisis and its replacement with a Conservative one had played no part in Hart declining the appointment. The Liberal magazine Fun was similarly enthusiastic about Hart around the same time. During an 1886 dispute over the quality of tea exported from China, it summarised the affair in the following terms: that heathen Chinese is again doing wrong with the fragrant Bahei, Picos, Congo and Souchong, and similar teas that we British have fondly imbibed for so long, and so a brave Hart, Sir Robert's his name, has seen fit to impart his disgust at the same, etc., 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 goes on. So Fun shows us an account there of Hart that's still found in some historiography, British and Chinese, a Hart who acted as Britain's agent, attacking the government which employed him where necessary in order to defend British commercial interests. Some Chinese, particularly in the early part of Hart's career, took an early view, however, that Hart could serve their interests rather than Britain's. He quickly established himself at China's Qing court, making easy conversation with officials, writing essays in Chinese like Bystander's View in 1866. Following the great Chinese minister Prince Gong, some in the court were so comfortable with him that he became known, perhaps, I think a little ironically, as Warmendeherde or Hart. By the 1890s, Hart's Chinese critics outnumbered his friends, however, and he was widely considered in China to be both corrupt and irretrievably pro-British. The reformer Chen Zi, in an 1894 essay, wrote of Hart that he bears lots of conspiracies in his mind, and there is no way to see through the plots he conceives about China. So having previously been claimed by both the British and Chinese governments as our Hart. By the 20th century, he was increasingly starting to be seen as nobody's Hart but his own. Premature obituaries published in 1900, when false news of Hart's death in the siege was widely reported in London, painted a complex picture of Hart's loyalties. Country life regarded him as the essence of Anglo-Irish gentlemanly virtue, calling him a typical shrewd North of Ireland man, while the country gentlemen celebrated Hart's resurrection by describing his siege telegram as laconic, self-possessed, and epigrammatic, the literary gem of the siege, so characteristically British under the circumstances, and splendid after the hysteria we have been inundated with lately. But other parts of the British press had turned more decisively against Hart. Vanity Fair produced a famous cartoon of Hart in 1894, in which he is shown in Chinese costume that is not coincidentally green. After his falsely reported death in 1900, the Times observed that Hart had a particular subjectivity of judgment in connection with all things Chinese, which diminished the value of his unrivaled knowledge of China. The influence he exercised over British policy cannot be said to have been wholly beneficial, for in his uncompromising loyalty to those he served, i.e. China, he was bound to act as their advocate and champion. So by 1901, Hart was being roundly criticised in Britain as close to traitorous, with one commentator complaining, "The cynical boldness with which he, Hart, justifies or palliates the conduct of the Chinese is conclusive proof that English statesmen could find no more untrustworthy guide in Far Eastern affairs among British subjects." Note the description there of Hart not as British, but as a British subject. So by the later part of his career, Hart, having initially been seen as perhaps both British and Chinese, was increasingly starting to be seen as neither. There is an elusive quality to Robert Hart's sense of himself, and Hart, as we know from existing research, described himself variously as British, Irish, and Ulsterman, and quite often, especially at the beginning, as English. Jerusha McCormack, the editor of the 2009 RTE collection, China and the Irish, used Hart as a surprising metaphor for Irishness itself, arguing that being Irish, even today, is a complex fate, and this multiple and possibly at times competing sense of identity is characteristic of being Irish. So on that reading, Hart is not merely marginally or coincidentally, but essentially Irish. The identity which Hart attached to himself depended on his audience and on which aspects of his personality, identity, and experience were in his mind. Robert Foster in Paddy and Mr. Punch has argued that England carries a historical charge, an assertion of power, an implication of cultural dominance, which is not conveyed to an Irish ear by Britain. And Hart, I think, would have identified with that analysis, at least to judge by the way that he used the word English. He wrote on one occasion that the only men in the customs service who are not under the thumbs of their consuls and legations are Englishmen, and all the rest, however efficient, have to toe the line whenever their officials want them. So in this statement, Hart was certainly including under English not only himself, but also the other Irish in the customs, including his brother-in-law and nephew, whom Hart considered all alike to be perfectly immune from government persuasion. Richard O'Leary has suggested that understanding this aspect of his identity might help us to get a better handle on his semi-detached attitude to British influence. For an Englishman, O'Leary argues, British rule in his own country is not problematic and he may rarely be asked to defend it, but Hart was part of a minority section of the Irish population who had to argue why Britain should continue to rule Ireland, which may have made Hart better equipped to understand and engage with the critics of British administration. And certainly we see that cultural fluency in Hart's experience. But it is notable that Hart was remarkably reluctant to defend British rule in Ireland or in influence in China, or indeed anywhere else. In 1867, Hart wrote in his diary that it never occurred to me before that we English are just the very people on whom the Chinese ought to look with the greatest dislike, the strongest hatred, and the most wrongful feelings. I've always taken it for granted, made it a postulate, a law of thought, that we English, doing the work for China, are trusted and liked by them. How odd, if true, if they really look upon me with suspicion and dislike, and yet how natural. We English have dragged them into 2 wars, burnt their palace, and played the mischief everywhere. We have been the leaders in all acts of violence and the loudest talkers about humanity. So let's ponder that for a moment from somebody often described in imperial context. We have been the leaders in all acts of violence and the loudest talkers about humanity. Hart, of course, there referred to himself as we English not once but 3 times. Hart spent much of his energy creating a little Ulster diaspora in China. He nominated numerous Ulstermen to positions in the customs, the China Postal Department, and other branches of Chinese service, and many others were attracted to China by Hart's example. In total, 8 members of his family worked for the customs. His nephew Freddie Mays became an Inspector General, and Hart nominated at least 2 graduates, S.M. Russell and C.H. Oliver, to teaching posts at the Interpreters College, later part of Peking University. Many Queen's graduates worked as doctors, some at Hart's recommendation. Speaking in Lisbon in 1908 after his retirement, Hart said, "I've always felt proud to think that the banks of the Lagan had supplied such talent for the world's work in so far off an empire." It's a conspicuous phrase, talent for the world's work in China, not talent for China's work, but for the world's work. Hart borrowed it from the title of an American magazine to which he was a subscriber. According to World's Work magazine, it celebrated the glories of the newly organised world and the cheerful spirit of men who do things. The perfection of method and of mechanism has done more to spread well-being among the masses, has changed social ideals and intellectual points of view. This cosmopolitan analysis, of course, appealed greatly to Hart. Although the Boxer Uprising in 1900 had presented him with an alternative view, namely that forcing China into a globalized system on the West's terms had not spread well-being among the masses, but rather had resulted in the deaths of thousands and almost in the complete departure of China from that global system. The Boxers had, in Hart's words, intended to destroy Christian converts and stamp out Christianity and to free China from a foreign cult, and on the whole not to hurt or kill but to terrify foreigners, frighten them out of the country, and thus free China from the intrusion of aliens. Hart perceived correctly that the expulsion of foreign influence from China is the object which will be kept in view, worked up to, and in all probability accomplished during the new century. The approach adopted by Britain after the Boxer Uprising would bring, Hart was convinced, nothing but bad. So when Hart told the Lisbon City Council in 1908 that his Ulster diaspora was doing the world's work in China, he was perfectly aware that the world's work in China might be largely unwanted by the Chinese and might very well be unsustainable. Yet Hart couldn't quite bring himself to renounce his pride in this idea. And I think in it we see the echo of the young Hart in a Methodist chapel in Belfast 54 years earlier, listening as Reverend Urwick imagined what could be achieved if only minds in Ireland and minds in China, resolutely and prayerfully concentrated, would assist in prospering China to the claims in our age. British missionary rhetoric urging the government to force China to accept evangelization was transmuted into the claim that imperialism in China was a moral duty, ironically enough, given how debased most evangelicals considered empire to be. For a 19-year-old Hart, an untypical Methodist, going to China promised to square the circle of his faith and his vices. Too licentious to be a missionary, he could nonetheless serve God and the public good by advancing China's interests. Hart continued to wonder if he'd found the correct balance between what Urwick had called China's interest, your own, and those of your country. Towards the end of his career, Hart, as I mentioned at the start, admitted to himself that there had been a mixture of motives, self, the public, and China, perhaps with more weight given to number one than was right. Now, perhaps the most interesting aspect of this remark is the casual reference to the public. This might be assumed to be a reference to the British public interest, but it is perhaps better understood as an assertion of a universal public good, a concept which lost none of its meaning for Hart even as he began to appreciate the difficulty of advancing it or even defining what it might be. So while scholars from Mason to Hillerman have emphasized the importance of missionary Orientalism in shaping Western understandings of China, comparatively little attention has been paid to evangelicalism as a factor in British imperialism in China. The dearth of Irish participation in Irish China missions generated, one might suggest, a distinctively Irish evangelical optimism about the beneficence of British imperialism in China. And given the importance of faith to the young Robert Hart, and Hart's role setting the tone for the imperial maritime customs, this strand of mid-century Irish evangelical thinking represents, I suggest, a significant and neglected factor in shaping not just Hart as a man, but the dynamics of the foreign-dominated institutions which Hart established within the Qing state. He was a pivotal exponent of what might be identified as a broader, liberal, unionist imperialism. But his understanding of the purpose of British global influence was decisively shaped by a missionary willingness to criticise government policy and a deep pragmatism. Thus, in Hart, we have perhaps Ulster's foremost imperialist at the turn of the century, exhibiting only intermittent loyalty to British policy and even less interest in unionist politics. Hart's maritime customs was a deeply Ulster institution, filled with relatives and friends and acquaintances. Yet it was characterised as much by Hart's recalcitrance as by his abiding devotion to a liberal imperialism which had, by the end of his career, begun to look hopelessly naive. Rather than seeing Hart's identity simply in terms of his capacity to engage with criticism of British administration, we might, I suggest, also see Hart's identity as part of what made him ultimately unwilling to accept British policy as he found it. The empire he established in the maritime customs was not one of unconditional loyalty to the British government, but rather one in which he constantly vituperated British authorities for what he perceived to be their neglect of Britain's true interests as well as China's. So I think we might suggest that we see in Robert Hart a kind of approach to British imperial policy where the ideal outweighs even pretty fundamental political considerations about the Union. Indeed, the suggestion that British imperialism might carry with it ideals of global change and the world's work, which were too important in Hart's mind to be left up to the British government alone, however problematic Hart's own interpretation of those concepts proved to be.